Greetings. Welcome to Blackhat USA 2010. You are in the exploitation track, and I present to you Chris Valasek.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right. As he said, my name's Chris Valasek, and this is cross-site scripting for dummies. No, we're going to talk about the low fragmentation heap today, and a lot of things have kind of changed since Windows XP Service Pack 2, and we're going to go over all that stuff today. A lot of data structures have been added, right, to deal with this newfound technology that needed to add data structure. In my opinion, memory management has become probably far more complex than it used to be. You used to have these simple look-aside lists, right, that were just singly linked lists. Low fragmentation heap is kind of a bit more complex. Obviously, there's new security measures, and when I say this, this is the Windows Vista code base that has rolled into Windows 7 as well. And with all these security measures, you need to ensure that you can get the proper levels of determinism in the heap when exploiting vulnerabilities. Before writing a bunch of 4-byte addresses everywhere and getting a nice unlink, that's over. That doesn't exist anymore. But even with all this protection, there's still a lot to be done with metadata corruption, and we'll discuss that as well today. It's going to go in order from boring to boringer to most boring to fun. We'll talk about the core data structures, all the stuff they added in this new heap. We'll then talk about architecture, specifically the free list, and they have changed drastically since we've last visited them in the Windows XP codebase. And finally, everyone can feel free to go asleep while I go through the core algorithms, as I'll do it both for the front end and the back end. And lastly, we'll discuss tactics, specifically heap determinism, and then some exploitation techniques, one by Ben Hawks, which I call Ben Hawks number 1, and then another one that is strikingly similar by me, which is overriding this free entry offset. Before I start, I would like to kind of define some terms. I'm not trying to say any other terms are wrong and mine are right. I just want to be consistent throughout this talk, and they're also consistent throughout the paper I wrote with this presentation as well. I got all the code from a specific version of NTDLL. I know that's changed. I had a panic attack when I saw it changed. Luckily, not too much, if anything, was touched that I cover in this presentation. When I say block or blocks, 1 block equals 8 bytes. That's the unit measurement for keeping track of memory in the heap. A chunk is a contiguous piece of memory that is either measured in blocks or bytes. Of course, I'll say LFH instead of saying low fragmentation heap every time, because that's just a mouthful. And finally, this is probably the one that some people might not agree with, but when I use the term bucket or heap bucket, this actually refers to the size, a unit measurement, instead of actually a piece of committed memory that will service requests. I do this because there's a heap bucket data structure in the debugging symbols, and it's a 4-byte data structure that is solely used for indices and size. When I talk about the committed memory that's used to service these requests, I'll say heap bin, user blocks, or something of that nature. Okay. Time for the core data structures. If you don't understand all these right off the bat, that's okay. They're kind of complex, and I think you'll get a better idea of how they work once we go through the algorithm section. We'll start with the kind of heart of all this. Every heap that gets created is going to have a heap base, and this heap base is this big data structure, and it's really similar to how it was in Windows XP, but some things have changed. There are security mechanisms. The first thing I'll talk about is a thing called the encode flag mask. This is a value that's set in the heap create call, and it's used to check to see if a chunk was encoded. It'll do a bitwise operation and determine if a chunk was encoded or not. That brings us to the encoding member. This encoding member is a pseudo-randomly generated value during heap create that actually used in the encoding process when encoding chunk headers, which we'll talk about as we go on. The blocks index, or the heap list lookup structure, is the next slide, and I think is the second most important data structure in the Windows 7 heap. That brings us to the free lists, and these are similar to the free lists that were in Windows XP, but instead of having these dedicated free lists, you have this overall free list structure, and we'll go over that more in the architecture section. Just remember that this pointer resides in the heap base. And finally, you have a front-end heap, and the only front-end heap supported by Windows 7 is the low fragmentation heap. There is no more look-aside list. The heap list lookup, or blocks index. It is a linked list data structure, so the first member is a pointer to the next blocks index. If there isn't one, it's going to be null. It has an array size. It tracks chunks of a certain size. And this array size is measured in blocks and says this is how many in blocks chunks I will track. So the first blocks index, as I call it, will track all chunks below 80 blocks or 124 bytes. The second one will track chunks under 800 blocks or 16K. You have a base index. Since there's multiple blocks index and they measure different sizes, this is just used to get a relative offset to places. Then you have a list head. And this list head is literally identical to the heap free list pointer. It's assigned during creation in heap create or RTLP extend list lookup. So it is literally identical to the pointer that is in the heap base. Now that you have multiple blocks index, and these blocks index contain list hints, right? These list hints are kind of like the old free list, as they're dedicated at a certain size, but they actually can go into the next size as well. We'll go over this in the architecture section. And be it that each one of these blocks index can have free lists, right? You're going to need the optimization, the list in use ulong, aka the free list in use bitmap. Instead of having one just in heap base, you're going to have one for each blocks index. The low fragmentation heap block zone structure is a small data structure that's used solely for providing addresses to create other data structures. And we'll kind of get on this more in the allocation section. The low fragmentation heap, as you can probably guess, keeps track of items in the low fragmentation heap. And I think the most important data structures are the buckets. These are the 4-byte data structure, the heap buckets that I talked about. You see that there's only 128 of them, right? But the low fragmentation heap can keep track of 16K. That means there's less buckets than there are chunks. There's actually an algorithm that is used to determine if a chunk can be serviced by the low fragmentation heap. This low fragmentation heap contains a heap local data. And this heap local data, sole purpose is providing an array of heap local segment info structures. Again, there was 128 of them. The kind of same algorithm is used to determine if there's one for a certain size. These local segment info structures contain things called heap subsegments. And I know this is kind of really boring and tricky, but hopefully I have a diagram at the end that will sum all this up. But these heap subsegments are actually used for servicing requests. They contain pointers to committed memory that is used for allocation and then freeing into them as well. Each subsegment will contain, I think, two most integral pointers. The user blocks, which is a pointer to a heap user data header. And that user data header precedes a big block of memory that we're going to call the user blocks. That's the committed memory we use to allocate and free memory. It also has an interlock sequence structure. And this structure here, sole purpose is keeping track of the state of that user block. It keeps track of a depth. That is, how many chunks does this thing have left? It also keeps track of an offset. The offset is, where is the next free chunk of memory I can use? And as you see, this is the heap user data header. It's a simple 16-byte structure and then the big block of memory that we're going to use. The interlock sequence, as I said, keeps tracks of depths and offset. Lastly, we're going to cover the heap entry structure, which is what a lot of people refer to as the chunk header, right? It has changed drastically since Windows XP, but it still contains a lot of the same information. You have your size, you have flags, whether it's free or whether it's busy, and you're going to have a checksum in the third offset. Just to let you know, only the first 4 bytes of this 8-byte data structure are encoded, and we'll talk about that more as we get along in this presentation. Okay. So here's my overview, and I redid this a few times, and my buddy John Larimer helped me pan it out so it wasn't a big jumbled mess. But this basically has the heap. It contains a heap list lookup, right? And it contains a low fragmentation heap. That low fragmentation heap contains a heap local data, which contains an array of heap local segment info structures, which contains heap subsegments. And those subsegments, they hold pointers to committed memory, right? And it holds a structure that's going to keep track of how much of that memory is left and where should I get the next piece. So I think this diagram kind of works out well how everything works. On to the architecture section. Back a long time ago, right, there were free lists and they were dedicated. That is, a dedicated free list would only hold chunks of a certain size, no greater, no less. If they were empty, they would actually have the forward link and backlink pointer pointing back to the Sentinel node, to themselves. And that would denote that they're an empty list. These all resided on the heap base. That's no longer the case anymore. These dedicated free lists have been shed for these list hints, or we'll still call them free lists, they're just not dedicated. They don't terminate by pointing back to themselves, they just point to the next biggest chunk. The last biggest chunk on the list is going to point to that heap free list pointer on heap base. Now, they're the same in that they're a linked list structure, but the backlink of these free lists kind of serves a dual purpose now. In the Sentinel nodes, in that blocks index, the list hint structure that I was talking about, these do contain lists for a certain size. But in the backlink, if a low fragmentation heap isn't in use for it, it's going to keep a counter. And that counter is going to be used to actually enable the low fragmentation heap after it's reached a certain threshold. If it doesn't contain a counter, it's going to contain a heap bucket. And it's the address of a heap bucket +1. That's how the allocator and deallocator know whether to use the front end heap, the low fragmentation heap, or the back end. And like I said before, the low fragmentation heap only deals with chunks from 8 to 16K in bytes. That doesn't mean the blocks index don't track chunks larger than that. It's just that the low fragmentation heap won't do any of the work for them. Okay, so here's a little simple example I have. It's only a small heap that has the first blocks index enabled, and it has 5 chunks that it's tracking. The first 3 chunks, going from upper right-hand corner to bottom, are for 6 blocks. But as you see, the third one for 6 blocks doesn't point back to the blocks index structure. It actually points down to the next biggest chunk, which is of size 7 blocks. This differs greatly, obviously, from how it worked in Windows XP. That chunk for size of 7 blocks, again, doesn't terminate itself. It points to the next biggest chunk. This next biggest chunk is held in a special free list. This is very similar to how free list 0 worked in Windows XP. You're going to have a list hint that holds all chunks greater than array size -1 at a certain position. This finally, since it's the last chunk that we're managing, points back to the heap base in the free list member section. But you also see that there's a free list at free list 8 that doesn't have a forward link pointer everywhere, but it does have a backlink that can be bitwise ANDed with 1. And if that passes true, then it contains a heap bucket, and this one does. You see all the other ones that do have forward link pointers actually contain an integer value. This is the counter that's used to enable the low fragmentation heap. I like to think of these new free list structure as a circular organization of chunk headers, or a cock. And these cocks are much like the highway system, right? So you're going to wrap around. The example I like to give is you don't go to mile 0 at US 1 to get on it. You're going to find the nearest tributary to get on it yourself, right? So that's what the list hints are like. Now, if the list hints fails and you're in Cuba, you probably have to start at mile 1 and go from there. So hopefully with this explanation and example and my newly devised acronym, you will remember how the free lists work. Okay, we're going to start with allocation. I like to start with allocation because you can't free a chunk without allocating it first. The allocation function kind of starts off with a little bit of a wrapper, as does free. The first thing this wrapper is going to do is it's going to ensure that the size you pass to it is 8 byte aligned. It's going to round it to the nearest 8 byte integer, right? This also, if you pass it 0, it's still going to give you 8 bytes back. At least in user land, this is how memory works. A lot of people think if you pass it 0, it's going to give you nothing back. It'll actually round it to 8 and give you 8 bytes back. So just to clear that up, if everyone thought you would get 0 bytes back in user land. The next thing it does is pretty simple. It starts iterating through those blocks index structures, right? And they had the array size. And it's going to say, does the chunk I want, is it bigger than this array size? If it is, it's going to try to go to the next block's index. If it doesn't have one, it's going to use the index of that special free list 0-like structure to start searching for this allocation request. Again, throughout this presentation, we'll refer to this piece of code as blocks index search. OK. So now it has an index. What's it going to do? It's going to get the list hint for that certain index. And if that list hint exists and the backlink of it can be ANDed with 1, it's going to use the low fragmentation heap. If anything else fails, it will use the backend manager to service this request. I'd just like to reiterate that the backend manager is used in failure, whether there's no heap bucket or the front-end manager fails. OK, so we have to decide which piece of this we're going to look at first. And I'd like to look at the backend manager first, because the backend manager is actually responsible for activating and enabling the low fragmentation heap. Again, the first thing it does is it sees that list hint or free list you pass it. If it's valid, it goes on its way. If it's not, again, it does rounding. You pass it 0 bytes, you're still going to get 8. The next thing it looks at is, does this heap support serialization? And if it does not, the low fragmentation heap will never be used. You need to support serialization for the low fragmentation heap ever to be used. If serialization is supported, it checks the compatibility flags. If these certain flags are set, it calls this function, perform heap maintenance. This is what will actually activate the low fragmentation heap. If you just create a heap and start making allocations, they will not come from the low fragmentation heap. They will come from the backend manager until certain heuristics are met. Well, how exactly these flags get set? They get set, again, by the backend manager. It checks the free list, did you pass it? Is it null? If it's not, and it doesn't contain a heap bucket, that's where the logical and 1 comes there. It adds a constant to it. And this constant is the one that we saw in our free list example. If it exceeds a certain amount, it's going to say, OK, get me the front-end manager from the heap and try to get a heap bucket from it. If this heap bucket returns null, that means that the low fragmentation heap is yet to be activated. And it will set the compatibility flags if the threshold has been met. If a heap bucket is given back, it will actually store that heap bucket in the backlink. So the next subsequent request for this size will be serviced by the low fragmentation heap instead of the backend. OK, now that all the heuristics are done for the low fragmentation heap, it will actually service the request from the backend. This is strikingly similar to how it was done in Windows XP Service Pack 2. It checks to see if the list hint you gave it contains a chunk. And if it does, we're going to safely unlink it. And by safely unlink it, it's going to make sure that its forward link and backlink values aren't tainted. If everything goes well, it unlinks the chunk from the list and gives it back to you. But if there was a list hint for that certain size and it doesn't work, we're going to have to go to our starting at mal0 for US1 type scenario. It's going to start at the beginning of the list head, which is the same as the heap free list, right? And it's going to just start traversing those. In the example I gave, it would start at that first chunk for 6 blocks. If the list head is empty, or the largest chunk on that free list can't service this request, it's going to need to extend the heap. And when I say extend the heap, it's going to need to commit more memory so it can service this request. If that's not the case, it starts going through these chunk headers, gets one, splits it up if necessary, and gives it back to the user. The backend allocator does a plethora of things. It activates the low fragmentation heap. It actually calculates heuristics to determine if the low fragmentation heap should be used. And then it'll service the request or get more memory. Now we'll see how the front-end allocator works, the low fragmentation heap. And this is a big blob of code, and it's ugly, but it's easier to explain, actually, than it is to read. the first thing that happens is that heap bucket that was stored in the backlink is passed, and the low fragmentation heap structure, the pointer for it, is actually calculated from that heap bucket based on size. So they don't pass a pointer of the low fragmentation heap there. They actually calculate it based off the bucket size. And in Ben Hawk's awesome paper in 2008, he theorized that if you could munge up this heap bucket in the size, you could potentially get a pointer back to a low fragmentation heap that wasn't so. That being said, the main goal of this is to get that heap subsegment based on the size, and it does that. It gets the local segment info, and it tries the hint first. The hint subsegment is only set if you've freed a chunk of that size. If you never free a chunk of that size, which in a real-world scenario never happens, but if you never do, the hint won't be set. It'll use the active subsegment. The code for these two things are identical, so I've only listed them one here, but basically in this example, you can replace the member hint with active subsegment, and it works exactly the same. So what does it want to do? It has this big chunk of memory, right, that we talked about, the user block. Well, the first thing it's going to do is get that interlock sequence structure, and it's going to get the free entry offset. The free entry offset tells you where's the first free chunk I can grab. Based on that, if the subsegment is in working order, which I guess I'll talk a little bit more about later, it gets the chunk based off that offset. But how does it calculate the next offset? Well, it looks at the first 2 bytes of the chunk that you've just grabbed and uses that as the next free offset. But that first 2 bytes is in user-readable and user-writable memory. So this is the whole premise for my free entry offset attack. Again, we'll talk more about this in the exploitation section. The depth is easy. It decrements it by 1. You've just taken 1 chunk from the user block. If all goes well, it returns it to user. If it doesn't go well, there's no user blocks. The depth is 0, which means there's no chunks left in it, right? It's going to have to acquire more memory via the backend for the front-end manager to use. This brings us to what I refer to as the magic formula, because it's magic. It looks complex, but just think of it as rounding it to the nearest page-aligned value to allocate memory for a certain size. If you can do that, it's pretty simple. Then it calls the function RTLP allocate user block. This, by its name, obviously, gets that big chunk from the backend manager. There is some caching and some indexing. If you read my paper, I talk about it more. But we'll just assume this is a wrapper for a call to the backend manager. Now that it's allocated a large chunk of memory for that user block, it's going to need a subsegment to couple it with, right? Because that subsegment holds a pointer to this user block. Well, it does this either by using one that was previously deleted, or it'll grab one from a pool of memory addresses. So instead of just allocating enough memory for one subsegment at a time, it's going to actually allocate this big bunch of memory and take a piece when needed. And when it runs out, it'll allocate more. And again, this I talk about in the observation section because it struck me as something that you could abuse if about 415 prerequisites are made. Now that you've gotten memory for a subsegment, you're going to have to initialize it. And what does initialization mean? It's going to take that user block, and it needs to split it up. The way it splits it up is by determining how big that block is and then dividing it by the size that you requested. So it takes that user chunk, it subtracts the size of a user data header, because we all know that precedes the user block, and then just divides it by that number and iterates through it. It doesn't actually take this memory and move it anywhere or set up a linked list. It just writes a heap entry or a chunk header every so often. So for 30 hex bytes, every 30 hex bytes there's going to be an 8-byte header. And it's pretty simple. There is 2 things to note. The interlock sequence structure. The free entry offset will always be initialized to 2. It's always initialized to 2 because that heap user data header is 16 bytes. It's measured in blocks. 2 times 8 is 16. The other neat thing to know is the last chunk in that user block, its 2-byte next free entry offset is set to -1. So if you could somehow read this value and you got to -1, you would know that you've reached the last block in that chunk. OK. I think the best way to show how the allocation from user blocks occurs is with an example. In this example, I'm going to use size 30 hex bytes for each chunk. You see that this is a full chunk. We just got it from the backend manager, and it's just been split up, and now we can make an allocation. The first allocation is the free entry offset is at 2. That's the first chunk. The depth is 2a. That number is based off the magic formula. I like to think of this as a big Sicilian pizza from Minio's in Squirrel Hill. So if anyone's from Pittsburgh, they'll know where that is. But you have this big pizza, and they're in big square slices. So let's say it's 2 in the morning, and you have Dr. Raid come over for a late night pizza party, right? And Dr. Raid's going to grab a slice. First thing, pushes everyone out of the way, your grandma, whatever, just to get his first slice. You see what happened, right? The free entry offset is updated to offset of 8 because that's what was stored in the first 2 bytes. The depth, decremented by 1, simple. Dr. Raid, being the jerk that he is going to grab another slice before anyone else at the party gets any. So now he has 2 slices of pizza on his plate, and no one else has any. Again, depth, decremented by 1. Free entry offset, updated to the next entry. Keep in mind that Dr. Raid has 2 pieces of pizza right now. No one has any, and we'll continue this example in the freeing section. Okay, on to freeing. Freeing, just like allocation, kind of has that stub function, RTL free heap. And this is just going to determine whether you should use the low fragmentation heap or the back end. It will do a few checks first. If you pass it null, it will return to you. If you pass it a non-8-byte aligned memory address, it will log the heap failure and return to you. So you can't pass null or non-8-byte aligned addresses. The next neat thing that I saw is it checks the chunk header's unused bytes. We'll just call it unused bytes. It's at offset 7. If that can be bitwise ANDed with hex 80, it will use the low fragmentation heap. If it can't, then it'll use the back end. The neat thing to realize right here is that piece of information in the chunk header isn't encoded. So if you can get an 8-byte overwrite, you can actually overwrite this value and free a chunk with the low fragmentation heap instead of the back end when it was allocated from the back end manager. Okay, we'll start with the back end just for consistency reasons here, and we'll see a few things. We see that search blocks index function, right, where it gets you an offset into the list hints. If that list hint can contain a value and it doesn't contain a heap bucket, it's going to subtract 2 from it. And this is used in the heuristic to determine whether ever to enable the low fragmentation heap for this size. So even if you did 400 allocation-free combos, the low fragmentation heap for that size would never be enabled. You need consecutive allocations for this to happen. Okay, we've updated these flags and done some things. If the heap permits, coalesce it, right? If the previous chunk is free, coalesce it with the chunk we're freeing. If the next chunk is free, coalesce the chunk we're freeing. Update the sizes. That again can be looked at more thoroughly in a paper written by Dr. McDonald and myself from 2009. All right, so now we've officially done everything we need to do. We've updated the low fragmentation heap heuristic. We've coalesced the chunks. How do you link this guy back in? Well, it's first going to attempt to determine can we actually, can we free this chunk in a certain location? If that list head doesn't contain any entries, it's easy. We're going to link it in the first spot. No need to do anything else. Otherwise, try to find that list hint, and traverse that entry until it finds a chunk bigger than itself. So what it does is inserts itself before the chunk that's bigger than it. This, again, is similar to Windows XP, but there are some changes. And here are the changes that I found strikingly sad for exploit writers. When it finds that list where it's inserting, and in our example, say we're freeing a chunk of size 6 blocks, right? It wouldn't insert it first before all of them. It would traverse through all the blocks of size 6, and then when it hit that one of 7, it would insert it before the one in 7. Well, before, Brett Moore had the ingenious idea that if you overwrote the backlink of one of these, and you could insert it before it, and if you overwrote the backlink, you could have that address point to the chunk you just freed. this really isn't the case anymore. They do a check, which we'll talk about more. You see that inserts blink flink equals insert list. It's just making sure that its backlink for link points to itself. If not, there's a log of a heap failure, but eventually you'll see, the chunk that you just freed will be, the list hint will be updated for it. Okay, so it updates, the backend updates a heuristic. It will coalesce chunks. It attempts to safely link in the chunk into the list. Let's see how the front end does things, be it that it's not just a bunch of linked lists. Okay. First thing that happens, it's going to get the chunk header. It usually does this by subtracting 8, but if certain flags are set, it will actually subtract more from that value. This is what Ben Hawks explained in his 2008 paper, and I have a kind of a contrived example in the exploitation section of this paper of how you could leverage this to gain code execution. The subsegment for this chunk is acquired. Again, it's not passed. It's calculated via certain values in the heap and the low fragmentation heap and the address of the chunk that you're freeing. By the way, that was really confusing when reversing this stuff because you had a bunch of weird arithmetic and a bunch of bitwise operations. It took me a while to figure out. OK, so now we've reached this point where we have this subsegment again, right? And we want to free to it. Again, the first thing you do, get that depth and get that offset. What you want to do is the offset to the next chunk that was stored in the interlock sequence structure, we're going to store it in the first 2 bytes of the chunk that we're freeing, because that will point to the next free one after we allocate this one. The depth, real easy. You add 1. You've just given a chunk back to the memory manager. If all goes well, it returns. I've left out a lot of code to show what happens, say, when you've freed every chunk in a user block. My paper explains it a little bit more, but it is confusing, and I just left it out for brevity's reason. OK, we'll continue with our Dr. Raid late night pizza thief example now. At this point, this guy has just taken a 3rd piece of pizza, and no one else has gotten one. You see what happened. The depth decremented again. The free entry offset points to 14. That's the next free slice of pizza we can use. Well, Dr. Raid, in all his slyness, realizes that first chunk, first piece of pizza he grabbed, it's ice cold. He doesn't want it. So what's he going to do? He's going to put it back in the box. And this updates our entries again. The free entry offset now points to 2. That is the first chunk. That is the first piece of pizza that was grabbed. The next offset in that chunk points to the previous free entry offset. See how the free entry offset here at the bottom is 14? You've just freed a chunk. The next entry offset is what was previously in that interlock sequence structure. Again, he's munching on that nice warm slice, 3rd piece of pizza, doesn't want the second one, and he puts it back. It's updated again. The free entry offset now points to 8. The depth has been incremented, and all those chunks are back. I like to think of this actually as a stack, right? So it's last in, first out. If we were to allocate memory, we would get that chunk. If we were to allocate again, we would get that chunk. So the first piece of memory you put in is going to be the last one you get out. And I think in the tactics section, it'll explain more of why this could be useful to you as well. On to security mechanisms. Everyone, I think, is kind of familiar with heap randomization, right? ASLR is prevalent. What they try to do is they will create a pseudo-random value that's 64K aligned, and they will add it to the heap base. That's so the heap isn't at attempts to make sure the heap isn't at the same address on every iteration. Be it that there's only 5 bits of entropy, I'm not saying it's impossible to guess that address. It is improbable. But if you have more than one attempt to guess the address, I think it could actually be doable, which I'll talk about in the exploitation section. We've seen some header encoding and decoding already. This made predictably overriding the size and the flags and the checksum nearly impossible if you didn't have an address link to figure out what values were used to XOR encode this stuff. there was a few things that I noticed. The first one I've already talked about. There's 4 bytes of this chunk header that have never been encoded. So if you could play around with those values, you could potentially leverage your way into an advantageous situation. The second being, you see how it does an AND, or it ensures the encode flag mask is non-null. This encode flag mask is set in the heap create function, but theoretically you could null it out. And if you null it out, that means this heap will no longer do encoding or decoding. The only problem with this is if you do this to a heap that has already been encoding chunks, the sizes of these things and the checksum will be all munged because they were already encoded, and if it treats as unencoded, they're going to be way off. Maybe you could create a new heap with this value and then do your size overwrites, but again, those are a lot of prerequisites. What did Matt Miller told me when I was writing this paper, you're laying the train tracks, you're not driving the train. I'm too stupid to drive the train, so I'll just lay the tracks and hopefully everyone else can figure out how to get the train down them. Lastly, for this one, you see that the header is ANDed with encode flag masks. That ensures that this chunk that you're getting was at once encoded. But if you can overwrite the encoded 4 bytes of encoded information and make sure that returns false, it won't decode the chunk. It will treat it as an unencoded chunk. The only place this is really useful to you is in freeing. If you can overwrite a free list to have this situation where it fails, you can actually manipulate the size. With that size manipulation, you may be able to set up walls in free lists where they'll stop because you have manipulated the size. Again, just something to think about. It could lead to something more prosperous. Death of the bitmap flip. John McDonald and I actually used bitmap flipping in our exploit last year when we did our XP 2003 talk. Now this is kind of dead. Before, if you could trick a free list into thinking it was empty and you could alter the size, you could there was an XOR operation, right, that would flip the bit. That's not the case anymore. They use bitwise AND when allocating. That is, if you're allocating from a list, it can only become empty. Allocating from a list can never lead to that list becoming populated, right? The same with freeing. They use bitwise OR. A populated list after a chunk has been taken out cannot become more populated. With the encoding of the sizes and everything else, this isn't really useful to you anyway. Not to mention, dedicated free lists aren't on heap base anymore. So all in all, it did fix it, but at the same time, it's not as useful as it used to be. Sorry, Nico. I apologize. They ruined it for you. The last thing I kind of already talked about is safe linking. And to my knowledge, I think this directly addresses Brett Moore's paper exploiting items on free list 0 in Windows XP Service Pack 2. You overwrite a B-link of an item on a free list. You insert a chunk before it. That address now points to the chunk you just freed. It's not the case. You get a heap log failure and a log what happened. The thing is, if the process doesn't terminate when the failure happens, you see that it just goes down and it will actually update that list hint and put your chunk in. Well, since the chunk hasn't safely been linked in, you fully control the forward link and backlink of that value. So if you could get this to happen, you still have to deal with safe unlinking when getting this item back off the list, and that does terminate. But if not, and you can figure out something ingenious, you fully control the forward link and backlink in this scenario. All right, I think we're done with most of the boring stuff. Now we can get to tactics. The first tactic when addressing the low fragmentation heap is, how do I enable it for a certain size? I can guarantee you if you make 18 consecutive allocations, the next allocation you will make will be in the low fragmentation heap. It will be coming from that user block. So this is pretty simple. You can do this in almost any application, i.e. create a bunch of DOM objects in a network application, send a bunch of requests. It will turn it on. Unfortunately, a lot of times this isn't the case for all this stuff. You're going to get these user blocks that have been used, and there's going to be holes in them. The next offset isn't going to be nicely to the next adjacent chunk. It could be all over the place, really. This is where defragmentation comes in. You have to normalize this heap. A prerequisite for all the attacks that at least I have are chunks being adjacent to each other, directly adjacent. Now, be it that all the chunks in a user block, right, are adjacent because it's one big contiguous block of memory, but at the same time, you're going to want two things right close to each other. I talked to Alex Sotorov about kind of what he did when he was exploiting these things, and he was saying that making a large amount of allocations for the same size would actually fill these holes. And if these holes are filled, you have adjacent chunks. Not to mention, if you make enough allocations, you can completely exhaust a user block. And it won't quit using it. It will just allocate more memory for it. So you could potentially get a nice fresh user block for yourself after making a large amount of allocations. What do you do with this adjacent data? I think a great example of what to do with adjacent data as of recently was Peter Vuchtenhil's, I hope I pronounced that correctly, but I don't think I did, paper that he did for Pwn2Own 2010. What he did is he overwrote a null terminator, right? And now that this null terminator was overwritten, the string was way longer than it was supposed to be, and he used it, in a process to exploit something. With adjacent data, you can overwrite chunk headers, and you can overwrite data inside of it. If you can get two C++ objects next to each other and write into the next one, that's going to be bad times for whoever wrote that application. Well, what if you can't afford to overwrite these things? What if the Munge C++ object is a few chunks away, and there's one used in between it? Well, you can actually use a series of allocations and frees based off the last in, first out structure of the low fragmentation heap. So you get these blocks. If you allocate a piece of memory, free it, allocate it directly again, you'll get the same address back each time for that given chunk. All right, so you have these chunks and you have adjacent data. What else can you do? Since you can get the same chunk back multiple times if you know the size and you kind of had a good idea of the allocation of a certain application. Data seeding. You can put data inside of chunks and have it stay there. If anyone went to Nico Weisman's talk yesterday, he gave you a very practical example of what you can do with the knowledge of data seeding and the sizes of allocations. Here in my example, I made 4 allocations. I wrote some memory to it. I freed all those 4 blocks. I made 4 subsequent allocations, this time not writing any memory. If you see, they generally have the same data inside of it. The only thing that's changed is the first 2 bytes, right? Because that's the free entry offset. And again, Nico talked in his presentation about using this, the free entry offset overwrite to overwrite a V table as well. So I think everyone should definitely check out his presentation, read his paper, buy him a beer downstairs. Okay, now it's time to talk about exploitation for all the busticati out there. The first thing I'll talk about is a technique that I call Ben Hawks number 1. Ben Hawks wrote a paper and did a Blackhat presentation in 2008. I've read it like 20 times, and there's literally like 30 techniques that he came up with in it. He just had a bunch of brilliant ideas. But I singled this one out because it just caught my eye. We saw when freeing a low fragmentation heap chunk, right, that if the unused bytes have a value of 5, more data is actually, the pointer is actually updated to a different location instead of the chunk header that you kind of just passed in there. Well, what could you do with this? You control the amount that is subtracted if you have an overwrite, and you control whether it gets triggered. I think the best thing that you could do with this is abuse C++ objects. So what you want to do, right, is you want to get 2 chunks adjacent to each other. One that you can overflow, one that you can overflow into. The one that you overflow into should be capable of being freed. If you overwrite those unused bytes to B5 and you overwrite the segment offset to a value control, you have 8 times 1 byte, so 8 times FF, negative range that you can point. Now it has to point to a valid heap entry, but if you're in the user blocks, every so often there are valid heap entries, especially if you make some allocations, there's going to be ones behind you. With this, you free that chunk, And since the last in, first out nature of the low fragmentation heap works, you make an allocation, you just got the address of, say, a C++ object that is currently in use. Overwrite whatever's there, especially the first 4 bytes. Hopefully that's a vtable. Make a call to that C++ object. At that point, you can work on defeating dep, ASLR, whatever you want. Now for my half-assed version of an exploitation tactic. Before I talk about it, I wanted to explain to everyone that everything in RTLP, low frag heap alloc from context, that's the low fragmentation heap allocator, is wrapped in a try catch-all. If there's any exceptions, 0 will be returned, and as I said before, the back-end manager will fulfill that request. This is where you could abuse basically brute forcing. We kind of hinted at this last year as well with the look-aside list as well. You could potentially start guessing addresses. If it's uncommitted memory, an exception happens. Nicely, the back-end allocator will fulfill the request. The calling process is none the wiser. If you can keep triggering this, you could potentially, guess values that could be the heap base, and you could perform Ben Hock's, heap handle override attack to gain code execution. But back to the free entry offset. So let's assume again a user block for a size of 30 hex bytes. And it's going to be a fresh user block. It doesn't necessarily have to be. You just need 2 adjacent chunks, one that you can overwrite and one that can be overwritten into. So if you would make an allocation here, the free entry offset would be updated to point to offset 8. That's the next chunk. If you made another allocation, offset E, another allocation, offset 14, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's because for size 30 hex bytes, it's 6 blocks. Well, what if you make an allocation and you overwrite the next offset entry? So that basically assumes you have at least 9 bytes of overflow, 10 to be preferable. Well, if you overwrite this next offset, you can overwrite it with whatever short you want, right? So that's FFFF times 8. That's forward range that you have. You make another allocation. The free entry offset now is a value that I wrote, 1501, instead of E that it should have been. A lot of people ask me, well, so what? If you have an overflow, just overflow everything in the user block, and overflow values. Well, you can be brutal about it. You could be a little bit elegant as well. You could try to get this so you don't munge all the data. You don't want to ruin every chunk header in a user block. What if there's C++ objects in that user block that are used? The application is going to crash. But if you only update this free entry offset, you kind of have a range to where you point to. Now the next allocation will be at the user blocks plus where the last chunk was, plus the free entry offset times 8. That, on this one, for size 30, would point off the memory page. It would point into uncommitted memory somewhere. But say after you do this, you create a bunch of objects of another size, specifically C++ objects, right? If you can get this within the range, it doesn't necessarily need to be in completely adjacent data. It just needs to be within the range you control. You can set these objects up. Make a subsequent allocation, right? Normally, under good circumstances, you would get the chunk at offset E, but now since we've munged the free entry offset, you can get the different address back. Hopefully, at this point, it points into those C++ objects. From there, you have a right end situation for whatever n is the bucket size that you're using. This could be used to skip over areas of uncommitted memory, possibly. Guard pages or whatever could technically, nullify this, but also you could kind of skip anywhere you want in memory and write data out without ruining everything in between it. So I thought it was neat because, a lot of the traditional overflows, you needed to destroy everything in its path to get where you're going. Kind of with this technique, you can be more selective about what you want to overwrite. The last thing I'm going to talk about is an observation, I guess. I didn't want to put it in the exploitation section because it has a lot of prerequisites, and a lot of them I haven't fully figured out yet. But I would totally like if someone looked at this and figured out exactly how to make this work. We talked about before an allocation, right? If the subsegment can't fulfill this allocation, it's going to need to allocate more memory. Well, it's going to allocate the user block first, and if that pool of addresses for the subsegments have been exhausted, or this is the first run of the low fragmentation heap, it's going to allocate memory for subsegments in directly adjacent memory. So there's a point where you could have a memory layout like this. You could have your user block directly before memory that's used for these heap subsegments. Well, what good does this do you? If you remember, heap subsegments have that user blocks pointer, and that user blocks pointer is used to give a memory address back to the calling process for which it can write. Well, at that point, choose an address you want to overwrite, make an allocation, and overwrite it. It sounds all fine and dandy. When I first looked at it, I thought it was that easy. As you see here, this is what you could potentially overwrite. You could overflow, or you could use kind of the free entry offset attack I came up with to elegantly skip over all the chunks you don't want to ruin into this zone. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to figure out when this scenario would happen, when you would run out of chunks in the user block and actually have it put directly adjacent or within range, at least, of the pool used for subsegments. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying I was too dumb and lazy to figure it out. So like I said, if someone wants to look at it more, figure it out, I think it would be really neat, because at this point, you're basically relying on pure heap metadata to get an n byte overwrite. There's really no trickeration involved with having 14 prerequisites of application layer data to overwrite. The other thing that kind of ruins this as well is there's a check in the allocator. It ensures that the subsegment's parent, that local info structure, we saw how kind of all these structures are parental, matches the one, the address stored in the low fragmentation heap. If you don't know this address, it will fail and just allocate more memory, which is not what you want. That being said, again, I think the free entry offset attack could be used to skip over this local info member, because it comes before the user block in memory. So maybe you could just skip over it and write directly to that user info and be done with it. But again, that's something I just kind of theorize about and have no kind of practical application at the moment. This kind of brings us to the end of this. I hope everyone saw that data structures were far more complex than they used to be, and these dedicated free lists have gone away. These list hints point into the overall free list. Security mechanisms are at their all-time highest. It's really difficult to exploit reliably heap overflows. That being said, normalization work is more important than ever. You're going to need to figure out how to get memory close to each other to do what you need to be done. But I do think there are still a lot of things to be done as well. I want to see a lot more Windows 7 reliable exploits out there. I want to see what other people think and what other techniques they have. Just for a few, the unencoded section of the heap entry, that could be abused for things. I didn't even begin to reverse any of the virtual debug allocation or free routines in Windows 7. That's a lot of ground to cover there for chunks of very large sizes. There's a lot of caching mechanisms that I left out for simplicity's sake that may be able to be abused accordingly. I think heap manipulation techniques are going to be even more important than the bug at that point. Dino and I the other night were talking about, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, at least at a per application level, you could write these programs that would put the heap in a guaranteed normalized state. And I think things like that are possible. You can ensure normalization if you know enough about the application and how it allocates and frees memory. Obviously, address leaks are going to be really important, because that's a prerequisite for everything nowadays, really, right? I mean, you can defeat DEP if an ASLR if you have a leaked address. The other thing I wanted to state was last year after our talk, Halvar Flake said, hey, you know what you guys should do? You should do a thing called HeapCon, and it's just a convention where everyone talks about different heaps and different operating systems, what they should do. And I thought it was a brilliant idea. I just don't want to do it. So maybe someone can organize that, and we can all go talk about heaps.
The reason why I said that was because I also think it's a great idea, and I don't want to do it either.
So he's passing it to me, and I'm passing it to someone else. That's fantastic. But I'd like to greet everyone who kind of did copy edits and helped me out. If I've left anyone off, I'm sorry, but it was a lot of work, and a lot of people actually, helped me do everything there. The Busticati, look out for one another, and that's how we roll. Now I have a little demo of a Immunity plugin I wrote. I think it's going to be released in the next release. Yeah, probably. I also uploaded at least, my script to the website for Blackhat. So what this script does is it just traverses these blocks index structures and kind of determines what heap buckets are in use. And let me get this all figured out. I think that would be neat for exploit writers, whoever. All right, while we're waiting for this, I will win a side bet with Twitter. I said I would say meow 10 times during this presentation. Meow, 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 meow. Someone owes me drinks downstairs. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing we'll do with IE here is we'll find a heap to use, right? And we'll just use this first one. My command is called horse because heaps are a lot like horses. They can't be trusted. Okay, so we'll do horse and then give it a heap to use. And slowly but surely, this will come up here, and we'll scroll up. Well, I want to be a consultant services manager. Damn, I should get hired. It shows you buckets here. So you see, for bucket 6, it has a heap bucket. For bucket 12, it's not using the low fragmentation heap yet. It actually only needs 2 more allocations, though, then it will start using it. So you can use this to determine what buckets are being used by the low fragmentation heap. And specifically, my thoughts were you want fresh user blocks to deal with. That way, you don't even need to defragment. I added another little command here. We'll clear the window. And you can actually say -n. Okay, these will give you all the heap buckets that have never been used. There have never been an allocation for this size. So you can say, hey, I can control this size. You can fully control when it's enabled and how many blocks. So while not that useful, it will give you a good idea on how much and how many blocks are used. So that being said, if there's any questions, you can ask me here or see me at the Galleria bar downstairs and buy me a drink.